First housekeeping that we want to share with you is that for anyone that's going to be using your mobile device to record the sound and or the presentation, we ask that you be very discreet about the comments that are being shared. We want to maintain the integrity of this presentation. We also would ask that you put your devices on silent so that it's not disruptive throughout the rest of the presentation. Is that fair? Yes? Okay, so I am a preacher, and I am used to hearing amens. Amen. Thank you very much. So, on August the 23rd, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and delivered one of the most profound and prolific speeches of all time. One part in particular continues to resound every single day, even today in this irrelevant and timely discussion. He said, "I have a dream that's deeply rooted in the American dream." That statement expressed King's deepest desire and gave birth to the idea that only one day will come when we too could lift our voices and sing, "America, America, God shed his blood on thee and crowned thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea." The complexity of Dr. King's provocative statement of faith that one day all citizens would have the opportunity to express the American dream, to experience the American dream, it points to the possibility of liberty and justice for all. Again, I say good evening. I want to start by thanking all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and be a part of tonight's preamble to a series of conversations around what we believe to be the pursuit of the American dream, which promises opportunities, class mobility, and prosperity for all. We are told the answer to the question of how are we doing on the promise lies in proposals of socialism, inclusive capitalism, and pure capitalism. Tonight, while we don't pretend to have all of the answers, Beyond Civility aims to understand these labels and their impact on our city and national society. The primary goal of Beyond Civility is to offer a safe space having interesting, mind-opening information that is cumulative in creating connections and productive conversations, which creating opportunities to explore divergent points of view. Tonight's event will consist of a group of panelists that bring unique perspectives on the subject of the American dream. CEO Tom Williams, from Northern America Properties, Derek Brazil, a development director for Mortar, Bridget Kelly, the voice of representative for Ohio's 31st District, Ellen Katz, president and CEO of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, and Beth Silvers, co-host of the podcast Pantsuit Politics. So I want you to sit back, relax, but I want you to also put your thinking caps on. Tonight, we will hear from Dr. Julia Heath, the director of the Economics Center at the University of Cincinnati, who will lead us in our first segment. And so, will you please join me and give her a round of applause?
Good evening. Following a preacher, that's where I want to be on the lineup. So Megan Cummings texted me and said, "Hey, do you know any socialists?" And I texted back and said, "No, maybe, I don't know. I thought this was a setup for some weird kind of joke." Long story, here I am. So what is socialism? What is capitalism? I'm going to take you back to your Econ 101 class, way back when. Every economy has three questions that they need to answer. They need to answer what will be produced, how will it be produced, and who gets it. Many of you are nodding. Yes, you remember that. So the way the economies answer these questions determines where that economy is going to lie on the capitalism-communism continuum. So capitalism. Capitalism answers those three questions very simply. The market. The market determines what gets produced. Consumers let their voices be heard through the market. Businesses decide how it's going to be produced, least cost, most profit, and who gets it is decided by the market again, whoever can afford to pay the price. We do not have a pure capitalist economy in the United States or anywhere in the world. Communism, again, very simple answer to those three questions. The answer is some centralized authority or person. What is produced? It's decided by the central authority. How? By the central authority. Who gets it? Whoever the central authority says gets it. Now, the problem with capitalism is that, and the answer to the who gets it, the problem with that is we have decided as a society that other people need to get things, other people than the people who can just afford it. Senior citizens, the disabled, children, we are not comfortable with saying if you can't afford food, you do not get it. So we make some accommodations to capitalism. In fact, in the United States, we make a lot of accommodations to capitalism. The government is present in a lot of factions of the capitalist system. Markets produce infrastructure that businesses use to conduct their business, roads, sewers, that kind of thing. The government provides the legal system within which markets can more efficiently operate. The government provides rules and regulations. The government steps in when the market produces the wrong amount. Sometimes the government steps in as the sole provider of a good. Think police protection, fire protection, national defense. So if your definition of socialism is government interference in markets, then we live in a socialist economy. Many of you went to socialist schools. You drove here tonight on socialist streets. Many of you eat food that has socialist backing in terms of agricultural price supports. If your definition of socialism is government interference, we're there, folks. Communism, their problem is that they don't respond to market demands. One of my former colleagues is an expert on Soviet planned economies. And back before things started changing in Russia and the Eastern Bloc countries, he and his family spent some time in Poland. And they had to line up, along with everybody else, to get basic things. Bread, chicken, soap. I mean, just basic stuff. What stores in Poland did have a lot of, sorry, Pastor, were vibrators. Lots and lots of vibrators. No batteries. You had to go to East Germany to get the batteries. So clearly, what is being produced was not meeting what consumers said needed to be produced. So in the middle, you have various gradations of economies. Some are capitalist leaning, some are communist leaning, socialist leaning. The fact of the matter is, the longer an economy has been in existence, the more likely it is to move somewhere in the middle. So I'm suggesting that we reframe the discussion. The fact of the matter is, among the Democratic candidates, there's only one industry that's being discussed to nationalize, and that's the health insurance industry. That hardly qualifies as calling for a socialist economy. There's only one industry, and not all candidates are even putting that forward as part of their plank. So the candidates' positions are not really socialist positions. It's really a countervailing powers agenda. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term, countervailing powers. It was put forth by one of the smartest, I think, economists out there, he's no longer with us, John Kenneth Galbraith. Countervailing powers is basically capitalism leads to big corporations. Wealth gets concentrated, Teddy Roosevelt busted up the trusts. Capitalism leads to big. So we need other big institutions to balance that power, and other bigness counters bigness. So this discussion of is any economy capitalist or socialism, those are end states. That's when we're done. Those are end states. And it's not a very helpful discussion. So if we don't talk about those end states, but instead talk about countervailing powers, then we can have better discussions. We can have discussions about what institutions need to be more empowered to counter capitalism's effects. What institutions need to lose power to counter capitalism's effects? And what are the implications of those shifts in power? So we're not talking about end states. We're talking about more of a flow from one end to the other. We can talk policy and not ideology. Ideology is rigid. There are many, many non-socialists, wouldn't identify themselves as socialists. There are many, many non-socialists who see the need to rebalance power in favor of the public. If we just talk about ideology, people get stuck in that word. It allows for changing conditions. Again, if there's no end state, but a constant balancing act, a constant ebb and flow of who holds the power, then if the public has too little now, and we enact policies to kind of shift that power toward the public, then who's to say at some future time that the public won't have too much? And we need to shift power back. But again, if we're only talking about end states, we can't talk about these middle positions and the need to shift at one time and shift back in another time. And the paradox is, again, remember those three questions. What is going to be produced? How is it going to be produced? And who gets it? The paradox is that if capitalism is really, really successful, answering 1 and 2, what is going to be produced? How is it going to be produced? We will experience tremendous economic growth, which leads to a more socialist response to question number 3, who gets it? So it's not like capitalism and socialism cannot exist in the same economy. They can. In fact, if you answer question number 3, who gets it, with a socialist kind of approach, then for that to be most effective, you depend on capitalism to deliver the goods on questions 1 and 2. So these are not, and I know I just presented it as 2 ends of a continuum, but it doesn't have to be. There are 3 questions to answer here. So the successful capitalism in answering 1 and 2 can feed into successful socialism in answering 3. But unfortunately, this is where we, again, John Kenneth Galbraith, this is where we are. So my suggestion is if we can get past the labels of capitalism, inclusive capitalism, managed capitalism, democratic socialism, I don't know where those lines are when you get in the middle, because it all kind of comes down to the same thing. If we can get away from labeling things like that and instead talk about we need some more power here, less power here. I think it's a more fruitful discussion. So that tees it up.
So while you're giving your applause, please welcome our moderator for this evening's event, Miss Ellen Katz. Come on, let's give her a round of applause. I get the privilege of introducing our panelists.
I get to inquire, you get to introduce.
Excellent. Our first panelist is none other again than the CEO and president of Northern Properties, Mr. Tom Williams. Let's welcome Mr. Tom Williams at this time. Development Director of Mortar, his name is Derek Brazell. Welcome, Derek, at this time. She's the voice of the 31st District State Representative Bridget Kelly. Let's welcome Bridget at this time.
Okay, and here we go. So I don't know how much experience the audience has with Beyond Civility, but an amazing organization that's really breaking open conversation and discourse across all kinds of perspectives. And as is typical with Beyond Civility programs, we find that a nice way to open conversation is to learn a little bit about the individuals that you're going to hear from, more about sort of where they came from, so you can understand what their life's been like and how their perspectives perhaps have been developed. So in the spirit of that, I'd like to ask that each of you spend just a few minutes painting us a picture of the place and time you were born. Where did your family fit into the fabric of society? What do you recall were the events, economic conditions, and or social issues that most impacted your lives or perhaps were discussed around the dinner table? Who would like to start? Bridget, you want to start?
Sure, I'd love to start. So first of all, thank you so much for moderating tonight, Pastor Tate for the introduction, and for all the folks at Beyond Civility for gathering us together for what's always a great event. I'm really glad to be here tonight with my co-panelists for an important discussion. So my name's Bridget Kelly. I was born and raised in Norwood, and I actually grew up in the same house that my mom grew up in. And I think that public service and politics has always played a really important view in sort of my view of what our role is and how we work together. So I was always really close to my mom's mom. My grandma, she left me this book of life advice. And so when you open the front cover, it had the three things most important to me, and they were God, family, and the Democratic Party. And so I think that informed a lot of the values that I had both when I was growing up and now, the idea of community, faith, and service. My mom's dad was the mayor of Norwood in the 1950s, and I had a great time looking through some of his old literature that talked about strengthening communities, having good public service, making sure that Norwood kept its independence, but that's probably a difficult conversation for another night. And I think that with Norwood, one of the special things was that every time people thought she was totally knocked down and never coming back, she'd always find a way. It was a community that transitioned a lot from blue-collar community with a lot of manufacturing jobs to now a place with a lot of white-collar retail jobs, a place where people lived for 50 years to a place that's welcoming a lot of new families. And so I think that's sort of how I perceive my role in how all of this works, is to be able to see the changes in the community and being responsive to it, but also really keeping to heart where we started out.
Thanks, Bridget. Derek, you want to go next?
Sure. Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Good evening. My name is Derek Brazell. I should start by saying I'm not native to Cincinnati. I moved here almost 7 years ago, and I grew up in Northern Virginia. The funny thing about my story is that my dad grew up in inner city Toledo, Ohio, and he happened to be a really talented high school football player. He happened to have a high school football coach in his community that was looking for a good running back, and he took my dad in. And I joke that my dad, in many ways, was like the blind side, except he was not nearly as athletic and didn't go to the NFL. But there was a very similar story there. I have white grandparents who took in my dad and gave him the opportunity to go to college. He went to a college named Wittenberg University, which I am an alum. And in Wittenberg is in a city named Springfield. And in Springfield is where he met my mom. My mom comes from a lower income family in Springfield, Ohio, and at the time was a college dropout. But my parents got married, and that was the home that I grew up in. Two people who were first generation middle class trying to create opportunities for their kids. We lived in Northern Virginia, right outside of DC, which is one of the most multicultural places we have in the country. And I'll be honest with you, it was so multicultural, in many ways, I wasn't even aware of my blackness. Everyone was the same. We spoke the same, we shared dinner with families from all over the world. And when 9/11 happened, we came together as a community, which showed that racial reconciliation was a possibility and something that I still cherish to this day, recognizing that I could grow up and thrive in such a multicultural and diverse place. As I mentioned, I went to college in Ohio, which was a little bit different from Northern Virginia. It was not as multicultural, and it was the first time in my life I was ever called the N-word in Ohio, which I thought was very ironic. And when I was in college, as I mentioned, and my mom's family's from Springfield, I recognized that there were some differences in how we saw one another. They saw us as people who had quote-unquote gotten out, and there was some animosity, I believe, between my mom's side of the family and my side of the family, and it always made me feel very uncomfortable. I didn't fully understand why we were being treated differently, but I knew that we were being treated differently, and I wanted so badly to reconcile that relationship so that we can all be on the same page and be one big, giant family. I saw that they had so many talents and so many skills. They were smart, they were hardworking, but for whatever reason, they could not access the same resources that I had growing up in Northern Virginia. My Wittenberg education taught me that there were some systemic reasons for that. And I read a book by Booker T. Washington called Up From Slavery, and he proposed that using your skills, whether you're a cobbler who can fix shoes or you're a baker who provides baked goods, that can be a way to achieve some sort of equity in the American system. So I thought, what if I could work with my family members, help them start businesses, maybe that can repair our relationship. In many ways, that is what started me on this path towards thinking that the market and entrepreneurship and business could be a way for people of color all across our country to achieve some equality in socially, economically, and politically. So I moved to 3 minutes. Is that what I'm at 3 minutes, or I have 3 minutes left?
You're at.
Take 2 minutes.
So I'll make this really quick. That's the life that I've grown up in, of having a white family that has taken in my dad, and I think about that a lot. What if my dad was interested in chess or science or something else and not football? The reality is I probably would not be sitting in front of you guys today, and I really wrestle with that, and a system that I don't believe is equal. So that's the vantage I'm coming from, and I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Derek. I'm old line Cincinnati family. I grew up in Mount Lookout. I was born in '57, and I'm 6 of 6. That was obviously Mount Lookout, a very Catholic neighborhood where 6 was average. 8, 9, there were just so many kids. But because I was younger than my siblings, I saw the whole dysfunction take place in the late '60s in our family. The political battles, but also just with the war. And one of my sisters got divorced in the late '60s, and you can imagine my parents, they went to church, both of them, every day. So that was a disaster. I lost a brother a month after he graduated from Notre Dame. And it was tough. I mean, it was a very challenging time within our family. You had these parents that wanted to, keep, a good appearance going forward, and then these things happening around them, and watching them try to control that. And it was just, I had a pretty good view of it. My parents were both very involved in the community. My father, he did his community work pretty much at the board level. My mother She was on the streets. She taught, down and over the Rhine back in the 60s and 70s. And she drove down there and walked the streets. And that's how she did her work. So I was able to see those two in action. And, it rubbed off on me quite a bit. But that's my simple background, very, obviously not multicultural, not multiracial. You know what Mount Lookout is. It's a typical neighborhood in Cincinnati, and that's how I grew up.
Thanks. Great to get some insights into the people up front. So, from what you read about the program that we're kind of here to talk about the promise of the American dream and find out how we're doing. So with that, let's just sort of dive right in and just start with what is the American dream, and how do you think we're doing in achieving it? You want to start, Bridget?
Sure. Well, I think that the American dream is something that means different things to different people. For me, it means being able to go to work every day at a job that can pay the bills. It means being able to go to the doctor because you have health care that you can count on and afford, and it means that you can retire with safety and security. And I think that people feel like that is falling out of their grasp more and more because there are a lot of people in our communities who work really, really hard and can't get ahead. They work really, really hard and are still sort of staying even. And I think a lot of people have this idea of, okay, we want the next generation to have it better than us, to have it easier than us, to have a better life than us. And that is becoming increasingly more difficult because I think the literature shows that people are working harder and their wages aren't keeping up, that people are working harder and that healthcare is more difficult to come by, that people are working harder and defined benefit pensions are going away. So I think that it's something that, we'll continue to struggle with until there are some systemic and policy changes to move things in a different direction.
Yeah, all I would add is that I think the American dream is this idea that you can live and thrive and prosper in this country. And yes. I thought I couldn't hear myself. Sorry about that. I think the American dream is this idea that you can live and thrive in this country. How is it doing? Not great. If you look at household income statistics along racial lines, you'll see that white households have 6 figures more than black households, and it would take 228 years for that gap to be bridged successfully, and that's if nothing bad happens, and that we know isn't possible or true. So I would say the American dream is working really well for some and not so well for others.
That's exactly right. I mean, this country obviously was based on freedom and capitalism and private enterprise and so forth, but pardon me, it is not working for everyone. And the statistics are very, very alarming. And since our country is based on that freedom and private enterprise, our fiscal policy supports that. So with our fiscal policy supporting that, then it becomes the responsibility of the private sector and individuals to make it work for everyone. They have to do that, and we've gotten away from that. Milton Friedman came through very strong and started that shareholder values, number 1, 2, and 3, and nothing else. It has to seesaw back. It has to be about workforce. It has to be about community. It has to be about our environment. And if that's all taken care of, then the bottom line will be there. And that's proven time and time again. And we'll have examples of that tonight. But it's not working for everyone, and it has to change, or the government has to step in. This has happened all too often. None of us want that. So that's what we're here to talk about.
So do you all think that the American dream presumes that we all start from the same start line with the same opportunities? Do you think it does, the American dream? The way that we describe it, does it presume that we all start with the same opportunity?
For some people, I would say, yeah. They probably think that because we're all quote-unquote equal under the law, that we're starting from the same place, and I think that we would prove that that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that we don't start from the same place. And while it's all well and good for people to think, oh, yeah, everybody has, a fair shot at success as soon as they come into the world, I mean, that's just not real. And I think the statistics and the evidence sort of based on property taxes has been ruled unconstitutional for 30 years. And, the legislature's just like, we'll work on that, we'll work on that. But that's something that could be a great equalizer or a great way of creating more equity for people to have a chance to better succeed in our communities.
No, I totally agree.
Additional thoughts?
There's no challenge here.
Right. So
what we are
we're all
on.
kind of agreeing that we
no,
come
it's
into
not a
this
level
world
playing field, yeah.
facing different opportunities. So a great set of questions was posed in a meeting I was sitting in recently, and this one is going to involve audience participation. It requires a head nod. So the question is, do you all think it's fair for wealth to be inherited? Just nod your heads. Fair for wealth to be inherited? Yes. Fair for wealth to be inherited? Fair? Most people are saying, yeah, fair for wealth to be inherited. How about poverty?
It's not fair, but it is.
Mm-hmm. Just, I think, a nice back-to-back set of questions with respect to the American dream and being born with different points of opportunity. So Julie did a nice job of sort of explaining this continuum from capitalism to communism and various forms of capitalism that show up in between. So where would each of you say we are on the spectrum of the economic models that Julie presented?
I would say we have a capitalistic culture that has socialistic tendencies. I have to also point out that this year we're celebrating the 400th anniversary of slavery in this country, and we cannot have a conversation about capitalism without talking about the legacy of slavery and free labor in this country and how unfair that is. In a lot of ways, we're talking about reparations. If you think about it, African Americans represent the largest forced migration of any ethnic group in human history, came to this country, created all this wealth for free, and have never been compensated for that wealth. So there are people in this country who have inherited wealth that came off of free labor, and capitalism allows that to happen, and that, in my opinion, is an inherently unfair system. So, yeah, I have to make sure I mention that as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, no, it's not working, and it seems that over time, it's kind of almost starts from that question: do we all start from the same background? But over time, in many instances in history, as you know, whether that be Tsarist Russia with Romanovs and the Bolshevik Revolution, or whether that be the French Revolution, when too much power and money is concentrated in too few hands, and you have this polarization of wealth, you're going to have a revolution. If it's not in the streets, it's at the ballot box. And I think that's what we're seeing going on right now with, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren speaking socialism. And when we grow up, I went over to Eastern Europe after the wall fell. I saw Russia. I saw what those countries looked like and how they were. It was awful. I mean, you couldn't even get food. Those countries were in shambles, and Russia was really in shambles. So we grew up, even though we had liberal professors that we always enjoyed, arguing with and talking to and all that sort of thing. It's something we always grew up thinking that, that program did not work, and that this one does. But the way we've evolved and the way this has come about is we have this polarization. And that's why we're talking socialism. And regardless of what these terms mean, that's what we're talking. We're talking about, people are starting to talk about a single-payer health care system. Is that right? Is that the best way to go or not? We would love for everybody to have free education. We'd love for everybody to have free health care. How do we make it work? And so I'd say if the private sector's not going to, undertake inclusive capitalistic practices, then we're going to continue to evolve this way. I think you're seeing the drumbeat now among CEOs of major companies. You saw what the United States Chamber of Commerce came out with Jamie Dimon, and they're all starting to talk about a different format, not just basically shareholder value. They're talking about investing in employees, investing in community, customers. And the bottom line is we've learned, we founded a company about 10 years ago, Nehemiah Manufacturing. And we started it in the inner city to create jobs in the city. And we wound up taking on felons, and now we have practically our whole company is second chance citizens, ex-cons and felons and so forth. Our turnover probably should be 70 or 80% in this business. We make and sell consumer products. Our turnover is 15%. That goes right to the bottom line. The loyalty, the productivity, the culture in that company is phenomenal. And that's because of inclusive capitalistic practices. And I think that's the message that has to be, broadcast, is that if you do these things, your company is better off in every which way. It's simple human nature. You invest in people and they will blossom. And everything will take care of itself. So I've talked too long.
Well, Tom took us on a nice journey into talking a little bit about inclusive capitalism, and you know that last month the National Business Roundtable sort of changed its perspective on corporate decision-making practices and shifted from decision-making should be based on what's best for the shareholder to decision-making should be based on what's best for shareholders, other stakeholders, and community at large. So that's a pretty significant shift in perspective. And Tom references an inclusive capitalism practice right here in town, Nehemiah Manufacturing, as an opportunity that might create some serious change. So as a model, whether it's Nehemiah or any other inclusive capitalism practice, do you think we're on the right track? Do you see opportunities, any threats in that? What are your perspectives on that?
Well, I think that it doesn't matter so much as what we call it, but what the practice is and how is that working in the lives of everyday folks. So, you got a lot of people out here saying, you're a socialist, I'm a capitalist, but if you knock on somebody's door, what do they know? They know, am I making enough money to get ahead or not? Do I feel good about the health care that I have, or do I have health care at all? Is my life any better now? And that's what indicates whether systems are working or not working in our communities. And so there are a lot of people who are involved in making businesses, communities, states, our nation successful. And that's good, so long as that success can be shared among all of the people who build it and not just the shareholders at the top. Because the people who work hard every day are not empowered and don't have the means to fully participate in our economy, no matter what model it is, it's going to create a lot of challenges. If I don't know if I can keep my lights on, I'm not going to buy a cup of coffee at the coffee shop on my way to work. If I'm not sure that I can give my kid lunch money, then I'm not sticking anything extra in my grocery cart. And so I think we have to take sort of a broader look at what these systems mean in terms of how our economy as a whole function and what that means for our community.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on what Bridget was saying. First of all, starting with my personal story, I mentioned I moved here almost 7 years ago. I moved here for love, like some people do, and it didn't work out. But in that breakup, I went out in over the Rhine and tried to find things to, we'll say, distract me from that breakup. And I saw a neighborhood that was in transition. Many of those residents were being displaced and replaced with other folks. And that moment, I think, was a wake-up call for kind of the shift that we're seeing in Cincinnati. But it's also one of the reasons why I'm so excited about what's happening in Cincinnati. A lot of places across the country would have just allowed that to happen as it is. And I think we came together as a community and we realized that we're more powerful working together and making sure that as our city is changing, more people are brought along to participate. The organization that I'm sitting here representing, Mortar, was founded 5 years ago as a response to the gentrification of Over the Rhine. We didn't want to blame 3CDC or blame some of these organizations that were happening. We wanted to help them and provide them with an alternative. So as these new storefronts were being activated, as these new opportunities were being made available, we could say, here is a whole list of entrepreneurs of color, people that may not be in your Rolodex of entrepreneurs that you can now work with, that have been trained, that have been vetted, that you know will be supported every single step of the way. And as a result, I think that Over the Rhine is becoming more inclusive. And I think that's why Cincinnati is in a really interesting position, because Mortar is standing on the shoulders of giants. There are so many other great organizations in this community, great leaders in this community that are addressing some of the gaps, whether it's in poverty, whether it's in education, whether it's in economic opportunity. And I also see that there are churches like Christ Church Cathedral, the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, the Women's Fund, so many others, so many people that have come together and are putting their money where their mouth is and saying, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to fight arm in arm and shoulder to making sure that this community can be more representative, more just, more equitable. So I'm really excited, one, about this conversation, but I'm also excited about the work that Mortar and other organizations across the community are doing to make this city a better place. But I'll end with this. I'm sorry I'm kind of talking, but I'll end with this. I think Cincinnati is a great city. I love Cincinnati. I talk about it everywhere I go. But we're at this really interesting inflection point. We can, if we want to, become a model for what it really means to have an inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystem where everybody can participate. But the reality is that that is going to require risk. It requires risk in supporting and investing in non-traditional leadership. It requires taking a step aside and allowing new leadership to step up. It requires a whole variety of things. And that's my question for everyone in this room. Are we really willing to take those risks necessary, to make the sacrifices necessary to become more equitable and more just? My hope is that the answer to that question is yes, but it remains to be seen.
And I think a good follow-up question is, are we willing to risk not doing that? Because I'm just going to insert just a little point here, is, and you all may know this, but last year, more white people died than were born. By the spring of 2020, in less than 6 months, the majority of people in our country under the age of 18 will be people of color. And by 2044, the entire nation will be a majority people of color. In our community, it will happen 4 years earlier. So we know who the people are who are going to be participating in this capitalist society of ours. So can we even risk not being inclusive, would be my question. But let's just talk a little bit more about capitalism and what we know about it, and just think about, because I think we all kind of agreed that we're sort of leaning more toward Julie's chart in this direction. But how should a capitalist economy address issues of public interest that lack a profit motive? So the kinds of issues I'm referring to are ensuring a social safety net, preserving natural resources, ensuring there's no environmental harm. Who is supposed to pay for that?
Well, our system was set up so that, with the freedom, the private sector, to do that. I think that's what, we're talking about, whether it's climate, when you have politicians or a politician, saying, more coal, more coal, more coal, I mean, that is just absolutely irresponsible. And and I think the hard part is, for the private sector, these large companies to switch directions. I mean, it's convulsing and it's very difficult. And let's face it. I mean, humans run that, and they get caught up in what their format is, and it's hard to change. I mean, evolution is tough, and when some companies die. I mean, I think of the original Dow Jones, whatever. I don't think anyone's left. They're all gone, and so that evolution takes place. But like every evolution, I mean, there's blood on the carpet, and what the private sector, what the government has to do is set up incentive programs for the private sector to follow. And whether that's credits for or carbon taxes, whatever that is, take coal, for example, the government's got to set up the playing field, and the private sector's got to move into that. And it is going to be ugly. It does mean there are going to be less jobs in West Virginia where there are coal miners, and there are going to be more jobs in Arizona where there's more solar. It's a tough thing. But if the private sector doesn't take this on and the private sector doesn't address climate change, and the private sector doesn't address investing in their associates in their company and practicing inclusive capitalism, then this system's going to fail. This system is failing. And that's why we're all in this room talking about this. It is failing. And how much in welfare benefits does the government spend every year? Well, that statistic right there is telling you something's not working. I mean, look at the cliff effect. Look at that whole bad policy. So, we are founded on the principle of private enterprise, but private enterprise has got to act responsibly to the community, to the environment, to the people, or it's not going to work. I mean, it's that simple.
Well, and I would also say that government has to recognize that we have a role in investing in things like in the environment and in people and in good jobs to preserve our natural resources and create the promise of a better life in the future. Because the only thing that might be more difficult than changing things at a company might be changing things in the government, because we tend to operate a little more slowly than most. But I mean, I think we have to look at some of our policies and see if what we're doing is helping to lift people up or creating more barriers for people and pushing them down. So when we give tax incentives to multi-billion-dollar corporations who keep their workers in poverty, that's a problem. When we won't admit that climate change is a problem, that's an issue. When we're saying, oh yeah, we should open up, natural like forestry lands and places that have been preserved for generations for fracking, that's a problem, because those are things that we are never going to be able to get back. We have to recognize that, pay equity is a thing, and that women aren't paid the same as men, and that people of color are make less than their white counterparts. Like, we have to recognize that these things are problems that need attention and that need changes in policy in order to create a better future.
Did you want to comment on anything, Derek?
My only addition would be to highlight some positive things that are happening right now in Cincinnati. I spoke about this last week, but I had the pleasure of meeting with the mayor several years ago, and I was just talking about the work that we're doing, so he knew about our organization, and he asked, how can I help? And in that moment, I chose to use the lack of access to capital for minority entrepreneurs as a vehicle for the city of Cincinnati to step up. And from that moment, the city of Cincinnati government stepped up and allocated $1.5 million. That led to a $3.5 million investment with Fifth Third Bank, private sector, to invest in minority entrepreneurs in the city of Cincinnati. And that, I think, is a really interesting first step, a really innovative first step that brings together the private sector and government to support everyday citizens. So I would say that, again, there are some really intriguing things that are happening here that gives us some momentum where the rest of the country might be trying to figure things out that I think we need to continue to build on.
Yeah, thanks. Public-private partnerships can create a lot of power, for sure.
And it's already happening.
Yep. So Bridget mentioned pay equity. So last month, the Economic Policy Institute revealed a stat that I'd actually heard about at a meeting in Chicago a week ago today. And that is that since 1978, CEO compensation has increased 940%, while your typical worker's pay has increased 12%. So when we even talk about pay equity, when we think about the kinds of things that are happening right now, say with GM, how do we reconcile that stat? What's it going to do to us, and what can we do about it?
Well, I will say I think one of the most important things that we have in this country is the rights of workers to join together for collective action, whether it's to organize a union or to walk out in their workplace when things are not fair. It takes a village to create and produce the things that keep this country moving. And it is certainly well within the rights of people to stand up for what they've earned and what they have been promised. So I fully support all workers who want to join together to fight for a better life. And I think it's right to stand up and fight for the fact that, you know, we're seeing this gap increase. So we're seeing not only the gap increase between what workers make and what CEOs make, but between productivity and wages. So CEO pay goes up, worker pay stays stagnant, or even goes down a little bit relatively. Productivity goes up, wages stay stagnant. And so I think we're just asking more and more and more of people. And eventually, you know, in any system, people are going to say, hey, you know what? I have had enough, and it is time to do right by me and by my coworkers.
Other perspectives?
Yeah, you know, it's the other statistic that goes along with that is that, you know, the concentration of wealth and net worth in the United States has shrunk to a very small percentage of people. And I think what I said earlier, it's just, you know, we've seen this before. We've seen it in other countries in history. A revolution is going to take place. Now, in our country, because we have the ballot box, it's going to happen. It's happening there. It's happening there right now. But it's an atrocious statistic, what's happened, and it's not sustainable, period. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. And that's why a lot of these CEOs are waking up. And we've got a long way to go, but they are waking up. Larry Fink, BlackRock, he had $6 trillion of assets under management. They now want to only invest with companies that have a social purpose as well as, you know, as a successful opportunity. But and you know, the Business Roundtable, they all came out and they're moving away from Milton Friedman's theory of shareholder value only, and moving to a different model. And that's what has to happen, and it can't happen fast enough.
Derek, do you have any thoughts there?
I got it.
Okay. Increasingly we're putting people into boxes, right? Boxes with labels and separating people into categories. It's true among us as people. It's true among elected officials. So what should we do to turn down the rhetoric? And what do you think the consequences could be, particularly as we look toward a really important election year coming up in 2020?
You know, Alan Simpson, the senator from Wyoming, if you remember Alan, a very funny, intelligent guy. And they asked him about 15, 20 years ago, they said, Alan, back in the day, you know, you and Moynihan and Dole and Reagan and O'Neill, you guys actually at the end of the day got things done. And they said, what happened here? And he said two things. He said, one, they put TV cameras on Capitol Hill, and two, legislators stopped socializing together. Now, a third thing has happened since then. We all know we've gerrymandered this thing to where 20 or 25 seats in the House are actually in play, right? So that's a structural division that we've created. But it is very true. You know, leadership is about bringing people together. I wish one of these presidents would take 20 of them from the right, 20 of them from the left, and say, we're going to Camp David. Pack your bags, we're going. And one way. And we're going to work. And this weekend, all of your spouses are going to come up. And we're not going to talk business. We're going to have cocktails, we're going to throw horseshoes, whatever. Sunday, they're going home, and we're staying. Next weekend, all your children are going to come up, get to know each other. These folks can't stand each other. Reagan and O'Neill loved each other, and they worked together. And that's what we've lost. And so between the districts being gerrymandered, where you really don't have these inter-party battles, and the fact that they've drawn the line socially, I think it's a very serious issues. I mean, in the business world, you do business with someone, you get to know them, you get to know their spouse, you socialize a little bit, and we've lost that up there. And now it's hatred, and it's breeding across the country, and I think that this has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I would add that one thing that we need to start recognizing is our bias and how our biases might affect how we judge other people. I'll give you some funny examples, and I'll get to a more serious example. Shoes, right? I think many of us would see a pair of shoes and think, oh, I can put these on, and it will get me from point A to point B. I'm a weird person, and I researched how many other uses of shoes are there. Turns out there's 21. You could use a shoe as a paperweight. You could use a shoe as a bottle opener. That was a free one. If you're walking down an alley and you feel threatened, your shoe could be a weapon, right? And I think that that translates to so many other aspects of our society. If you see a person that has tattoos on their face, you might make a judgment about that person. If you see a guy wearing a mechanic shirt with tattoos on his arms, you might make a judgment about that. And I think that that shows up in so many sectors of our society. We think that the world should be based upon white middle-class norms. How does that work, for example, if you're trying to get a loan? What about your credit score, right? What about your 3 years of business financials and projections? These are things that we expect for borrowers to be able to provide, but the reality is that not everyone works in that way, and there's a lot of cultural context that we miss because we're all trying to see the world from one particular lens. And once we were able to recognize that all of us have our own ways of seeing the world, and we try to eliminate those biases about how we're trying to put each other in boxes, that's, in my opinion, how we can start working towards real racial and social reconciliation.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that, you know, people in all sorts of industries have to work with people that they really, really like and that they really, really don't like every single day. And people in elected office are no different. I have a lot of friends on the other side of the aisle, and we don't agree on a lot of things. But we can spar all day long on politics and on policy in a respectful way. So I can say, you know, I hate your ideas and I hate your politics, but I really like you as a person. Instead of, you know, I hate your ideas and I hate your politics and I hate your mom and I hate your dog and I hate your neighbor and I'm going to spend my entire life trying to destroy you, because that's not productive either. I think one of the other big challenge is finding a time to stand up and fight and finding a time for a pathway to compromise. I think a lot of people feel like there are so many litmus tests for one side or the other, and you have to meet them all in order to fit in a certain box. When the fact of the matter is, the best work that we do comes with when we find a resolution that's equally agreeable or equally disagreeable to everyone.
So I think we have just about 5 minutes left. Am I right, Patty? About 5? So I wanted to take an opportunity just to follow up on Derek's point about racial equity, because it's definitely near and dear to my heart. So I just want to ask a question with respect to it. So it's really about targeted universalism, which I'm sure many of you know is just the approach of doing for those that might need it more than others, and then that, of course, will lift everybody's tide at the same time. So a great example that I like to use is something called the curb cut effect. And in the 70s, the Architectural Barriers Act ensured that people with mobility issues would have an opportunity to get from place to place by creating curb cuts in all of our sidewalks. And of course, what an amazing example of targeted universalism, because who doesn't benefit from a curb cut, right? Your stroller, your skateboard, your suitcase, whatever. Everybody benefits from a curb cut. So we've been talking a lot at GCF about what would be the population in our community that would have that targeted universal effect. What population could we move along where her ecosystem and the improvement of it would make all of our lives better? And we believe the answer is African American women. So this is an approach around equity that you're smiling. Some people think, really? A major, major investment in African American women is going to create a rise for every one of us in the community? I'd love to hear what you think about that as a concept.
Would love to start on this. So Mortar's focus as a whole is to support historically marginalized populations. But if you look at the people that are coming through Mortar's program, it's reflective of a national trend, which is it's overwhelmingly African American women. And when you're able to invest, to provide opportunities for African American women, you see that there are so many benefits to that. And as an organization, we've decided to double down on that. So we are, as an organization, hyper-focused on providing every resource possible to invest more in black women, because we see that investments in black women can have this multiplier effect. So I think that as an organization, we have seen the benefits of that, and we're working towards that. So I would say that's our perspective.
Tom, Bridget?
I think men have screwed this thing up for 4,000 years. I'd like to see women take over the world, to be honest with you. I think we'd be a hell of a lot better off. But no, there's no doubt about it. We know that the single parent, the predominant single parent in our community is the African American woman. And my God, how strong is she? I mean, what she does every day just to get to work, it's just phenomenal. And I think it makes all the sense in the world. They're the leaders of the community.
I'm here for it. I want to help with it. And so I think it's also really important. And I also think it's really important to acknowledge that some communities need greater investment to make greater movement, because they haven't been invested in the way that they should have been for years and years and years. So if there's a way to make a significant investment in that and create a more equitable and a stronger foundation for a better future, then I say I'm here for it.
Last thing, I think it's possible to like pat your stomach and tap your head at the same time. So it's possible for that rising tide to lift all boats. We can support and be intentional with investing in black women, but it's also possible to support our immigrant communities. It's also possible to support returning citizens. I want us to be ambitious and bold enough to recognize that we can do all of these things at the same time and not create more divisions amongst one another.
And you know, there also is the disenfranchised male, you know, and not just in the African American community. If we had gender-blind admissions at universities today, it'd be 75 to 80% women, and that's true. And so you know, like you said, you lift up one segment and boats rise. You know, we have to keep our eye on this situation because it's really bad.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess Beyond Civility has done what it exists to do, right? We have 3 people with very different perspectives and backgrounds who come together, and I think if we were to pull together all of this brilliance, what a wonderful world it would be.
Hi guys, my name is Patty Foster. I'm the program director for Beyond Civility. So I've got 3 things to talk to you about tonight. First, we're going to have some thank yous. Second, we are going to remind you of what Beyond Civility does and why we're having this conversation in the first place. And third, we're going to let you know how the rest of the evening will play out. So get comfortable, we're not there yet. But I want to start with the thank yous. Heartfelt thank yous. Ellen, Bridget, Derek, Tom, you guys are amazing. Thank you for your time and the energy you brought to this conversation. I also want to thank Julie in absentia. Dr. Julie Heath had to leave us, unfortunately, so she won't be taking questions, but I was really grateful for her breakdown of the different economic models and a way to talk about them that might be more productive. And Ennis, thank you as always for your help and the introductions. Also, you're going to meet Beth Silvers in a minute. I'll get to that, but I want to thank her in advance. We have board members here, and we have staff members of Beyond Civility, and everybody does their work that makes this program happen. The Mercantile Library is the most fabulous venue, so we want to thank them. And Season Good Foundation, our sponsor, we want to thank them. Mostly, though, here I go, I want to thank you. You guys being here tonight is what we're here for. So this takes me to my second topic. Why do we do this work? What is Beyond Civility's mission? We know we cannot come up with a good answer about the American dream in a 90-minute gathering with 200 people. We would love to, but that's probably beyond our reach. It's also beyond our reach to find good answers to all the other polarizing topics we take on. We've had conversations about fake news in the age of free speech. We've had conversations about taking a knee during the national anthem. We've talked about income inequality. We've talked about the death penalty. We have these conversations in order to have these conversations, in order to have you guys all here with people you wouldn't otherwise be sitting next to, talking about things you wouldn't otherwise be talking about. And the hope is that those little nuggets of connection and empathy and information give you some nuance to take away, some thought-provoking conversations to have with other people, makes you better communicators, and hopefully it brings us all to a place where we open our minds a little bit. And that is Beyond Civility's mission. So thank you for being here. Thank you for making that happen. We really care about you, that you're heard, that you feel heard, and that's why we have a question hotline right here for you. Feel free to pull out your phones at any time and send a question, because we're going to be posing questions to our panelists. That's what Beth Silvers is going to do, and she'll be coming up in just a minute. But just so you know, we're so grateful to have Beth. She is one of the podcasters on Pantsuit Politics. It's one of my favorite go-to moments. They take, she and her cohort Sarah take really hot topics and take the day's news and turn it into a very nuanced conversation. She's also the co-author of a book called I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening, which I think pretty much sums up just about every conversation I've had in the last 12 months. So it's a great read, and yeah, feel free to look into that more. So let's see, we've got questions. Feel free to send them by email, we will get them, or we've got some note cards and there's a pencil every couple of seats. Feel free to write out any questions you've got, and if you wouldn't mind, kind of pass them towards the end. Beth or I or somebody will be collecting those, and she'll be getting those questions to our panelists in just a few seconds. It's also our goal to improve our programs at all times. Those kinds of great conversations with you. So if you're in one of those groups I just described, the board, the workshop, invited, could you stand up, please? Yeah. And you guys, once we start the Civility Caucus, we've got some snacks that we will invite you to come and enjoy. And we're going to ask you guys who just stood up, as well as our panelists, to spread around the room a little bit. We're entitled and invited to use all of these different areas at this fabulous space. So if you guys could kind of split up and be available and help promote some good conversations. If anybody doesn't know what to say or what to ask, we're going to be showing on the screen some ideas that will make that happen. And we're going to keep the interesting topics coming. Our next conversation is going to be about propaganda. It is on November 11th. There's some details up there. It is called My Truth is Your Propaganda. And we're going to talk about media outlets and the news that we get and how we feel about that news and how we feel about other people's news. And hopefully we're going to dig deep and have a good conversation. So let's see, where did I get to? One other thing we have been asking for throughout the evening is donations. We are a nonprofit, and we do this work with the good grace of people who are happy to see value in our work and contribute towards that work. So there is a website that we would point you to if you would like to share that conversation. This is a little more information about the Civility Caucus. We hope that you'll stay, enjoy a snack, start a great conversation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Beth. So please don't leave before you fill out your evaluations, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Hello. Thank you for the great questions that have already come in. I'm going to keep watching my email kind of rudely as our panel answers the questions after I pose them. I thought that I would start off with the panel by asking you a question that came in from Phyllis, and I would like to couch her question through the lens of a personal experience, if I can. I can, because I get to be the question moderator. So I grew up on a dairy farm in western Kentucky, a very small dairy farm, and I feel like a small dairy farm sits at the intersection of lots of competing American values. It's horribly inefficient to have small dairy farms scattered throughout rural America for producers to send trucks to collect that milk, to get that milk back to a plant in time for that milk to still be good milk that ends up on the shelves in grocery stores. You could make arguments about profits, about climate connected to small dairy farms, both for and against the idea that these farms are worth preserving. There are arguments about generational wealth in the form of land ownership. There are many, many layers to small dairy farms in America. And I think bringing a concrete example into the theory is important as we think about how this is not as simple as one model versus the other. I loved that about Julie's presentation at the beginning. So thinking about how many businesses are like what I've just described, how there are competing concerns and competing values that most of us would say we give a thumbs up to, and they run up against each other. Phyllis has asked, when you think about the model of sometimes the public has too much power and the balance needs to tip, sometimes the public has too little power and the balance needs to tip, Phyllis wants to know, what does the public having too much power look like? Just a softball there to get you started.
So I would start out by saying I don't think that the public has too much power at all. In fact, I would say it might be the other way around. I mean, we can use a concrete example of gerrymandering. I mean, a lot of folks in the public feel like their voice isn't being heard in their own district where they are able to participate in representative democracy. You know, and it doesn't reflect the values or their truths of what they see. So, I mean, I would sort of sit on the other side of that and say the public should have the power because, you know, the public is electing people to represent them. The public is the people that are working in companies that make, you know, them successful. The public is the people who are working on whether it's small dairy farms or big manufacturing plants. So I would say that those are the people that always should have the power, even if disproportionately so.
Would anyone else like to?
Oh, that's too bad. That's working. You know, there's no cosmic blueprint here. I mean, you know, there's no system that's going to solve all our problems. And no matter what system we're in, you know, there's going to be evolutions that take place. You know, there were guys that used to make buggy whips, right? Okay, well, you know, that business went out. So that's pain, and that's, you know, that's the evolution of technology, if you will, and what does that cause, you know? So there is no perfect answer. Obviously, we want some kind of balance where you have personal freedom in industry for people to build companies and provide a service, do whatever, and then you have to have checks and balances, you know, and policies, as Bridget said, that encourage good behavior and so forth, but you can't dictate, you can't preserve everybody's livelihood. It's going to change. The world has changed. There's always change, and we've seen it happen. What scares me, Derek and I talked about today, it scares me is technology. I am scared to death that technology is going to crush jobs. And, you know, we talk about Nehemiah, okay? We've got 150 employees down on the, you know, on the shop floor. We could put robots in there tomorrow and turn the whole thing over. Talk about driverless vehicles. What is that going to mean? So I think it's changes, those kind of systemic changes are really frightening. And there's got to be some kind of balance, obviously, between the private and the public to keep this system going. It can't be one or the other. And there is no right way or blueprint that we can follow. We're all going through the woods, guys. I mean, you know, we're $22 trillion in debt, and we're going to lose over $1 trillion this year. We printed $3 trillion 10 years ago. Well, where is this going? So, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, but it's got to be a balance and a working together of public policy and public support and private industry. And private industry is going to evolve, as it always has.
Tom, I see a number of questions directed to you in my pile here. And I'm going to synthesize them this way. What do you see in your colleagues and your counterparts that people are willing to give up to make room for the more inclusive capitalism that we've been talking about?
Well, the first thing they need to believe is that if they invest in their associates and they invest in the people in their company, and when they do that, the company is going to improve. The bottom line is going to improve. Shareholder value is going to improve. I know Johnson & Johnson has kind of screwed up recently, but historically, when that company went public, you know, their value system was customers first, employees second, community third, shareholders fourth. Johnson & Johnson outperformed Jack Welch and GE all through those years of Welch's, neutron, management style. It was all just simply Milton Friedman. So I think the first thing they have to adopt, and I think they're starting to try to understand it, is that you're going to have a better company, you're going to have a more profitable company if you invest in your people. And we've got to have the public policies to do that. If you invest in educating your workforce, it's an expense on your income statement. It does not become an asset on your balance sheet. That makes no sense. But that's the policy. Those policies have to be changed. We need to incent, proper behavior. CEO compensation has just gone, it's just totally out of control. And so public boards of companies need to get hold of that. CEOs have been running their boards. It's got to be the opposite. You have to have an independent chairman, not the CEO, and an independent board that's going to run the company. And they can't let that get out of control. And I see it in companies that I'm on boards of in Cincinnati, where there's a real conscious effort to keep, compensation all in line with each other. But it's going to take a whole different mode of thinking. But the backdrop to that thinking is all constituents, all stakeholders are going to be better off. If too few people are too greedy, it's not going to work. And that should not be sustainable.
Derek, I have a number of questions about the conversation you started on reparations, and wondered if you and your colleagues on the panel here could speak more about different systems of reparations and how those might play out, and whether the idea of investment specifically in African American women that we talked about at the end here is a form of reparations, or is that something different that needs to come alongside a reparations program?
It's a good question. I don't sit here as an expert on reparations, so I don't want to respond as if I am an expert. My understanding, as a very basic definition, is it is a repairing of past wrong. And I think that if you have a population like African American population, again, that has created a lot of profits and a lot of opportunity, there should be some sort of repayment. And I think originally you saw 40 acres and a mule as the way, yeah, exactly, it never happened. And there were some reasons for that. And I think the conversation about that is a good one. It's an important one. And there can be a variety of ways for that to happen. I don't know if giving every person of African descent $1,000 is the best way. But I believe that we should be honest about the original sin of this country, which is slavery, and about how we may be complicit in that. Not in a way that says that you're a bad person, but in a way that says that we should make this wrong right. And there should be creative mechanisms, whether it's privately and figuring out ways to invest in businesses led by black women, or maybe it's CEOs. People like Tom, who have mentored people all across our community, are starting the Nehemiah Project and providing opportunities. There have to be creative ways that we can make that wrong right. And I think as a society, we have to acknowledge that our country was founded on a racist principle of free labor, and we need to do something to make that right again. But I don't have all the answers to it. I do believe that we need to acknowledge that there is a problem. We have not made that problem right, and we need to acknowledge that we still need to do something about it.
I agree with all of that, but I think we also have to acknowledge that systemic racism is a problem and be willing to have real conversations about it. I mean, sometimes those conversations are really hard and really challenging, but I think that we have to have the courage to have a real honest conversation about what's happening in our society now and what's caused it to happen before and what we're going to do about it in the future.
Yeah. The last thing I would add is, I am with an organization, as I mentioned, Mortar, that supports entrepreneurs of color, and we try to bridge that racial wealth gap through entrepreneurship. And the reality is, we're an organization that is heavily reliant upon philanthropy. And that is a very easy way. I'm not saying support more necessarily. If you want to, please go do that. But if not, there's the United Way that's in town. There are a lot of organizations, probably collaborative, that are trying to figure out ways to bridge this gap, and we need to come together and invest in those opportunities. And that could be one way in lieu of the public sector.
I want to aggregate a couple of questions. Again, you had a conversation that I found really interesting about the role of elected representatives in polarization. We have a number of questions, though, that indicate that in this room, we have a sense that the public has been complicit and maybe driving that polarization. That perhaps elected officials spending more time together is a partial solution, but when their constituents are not supportive of them working across the aisle, there's a limit to what they can accomplish. And the public has focused on short-term results for a long time. The public has focused on policies that some people believe are folks voting against their own interests. I wonder how you feel about that phrase, people voting against their own interests, and how you see an ability to shift public sentiment in support of some of what you've advocated for this evening.
So I think it's kind of presumptuous, sorry, Tom. I think it's kind of presumptuous to say that people vote against their own interests because you don't necessarily know what their interests are or what their values are or what the whole picture of their life is. And so there may be some issues that are really important to them that they perceive as very much their interests, but they just might not align with what your interests are or what you value. And so I think that's a challenging place to start. But I think we also have to be willing to have hard conversations with folks about what they actually value and what is important to them. And I think gerrymandering has played a role in that because it's created really polarized districts where people are, afraid of a primary challenge. But at the end of the day, as elected representatives, our job is to represent the values of our constituents, and there's no better way to know the value of your constituents than to interact with them and talk to them about what's important. I will tell you a quick story. I was out knocking doors for a candidate, and I was talking to a woman, and she said, well, we are ardent Trump supporters in this house. And I said, well, I am not a Trump supporter. And she said, well, we vote for you. And we talked about the things that we agree on. And I was talking to her about the candidate that I was knocking doors for, and she supports him too. And it's more about the willingness to be able to have the conversation. So instead of her saying, I'm an ardent Trump supporter, and me saying, hey, thanks a lot, see you later, you have to be willing to engage on a deeper level to see what's important to people and why, to figure out how to move forward.
No, I don't really have too much to add. The gerrymandering is a serious problem. We've now systemically created this. It's in our system. And when we talk about a representative voting on behalf of their constituency, well, they are what their constituency is. That's how they were elected in the first place in these gerrymandered districts. So I think that structural change that we have or that we're facing or dealing with right now is a very serious problem. It's one of many, but that's a real serious one on this polarization piece.
We also have an audience member who would like to know to what extent you all think that having so many generations in the workforce impacts our ability to reach whatever your idea of the American dream might be.
I think that I understand the question. I'm not totally sure, but I think it's a huge problem. It's no different than the question that we started out with about inheriting wealth or inheriting poverty. I work for UFCW, which is a labor union that represents folks in the grocery and packing and processing industries, and we've had 3 generations of families who've worked in the same Kroger store before. We've had multiple generations of folks who have worked in a meat packing plant before, sometimes because they are the best jobs that you can find in an area, and sometimes because it's reliable employment where you can get health care and retirement security where you might not be able to find it elsewhere. But I think it also sets an example of if you see people who are able to attain a place where they can make a decent living and get healthier and have retirement security, then, you know, a lot of us learn by example. And it's like, okay, if my parents or my grandparents had a good life doing this, then maybe this is going to create a good life for me. And maybe I think this is the best avenue or the most accessible avenue because, you know, I've got a hard time finding childcare or transportation, or I can't afford to go to college, or, you know, I'm going into a particular vocation because that's what my family did. I mean, I think that it creates expectations and norms, certainly, but I think it's also hard because if you see 2 generations of yourself working until they're in their 80s, then that doesn't give me a lot of warm and fuzzies about building a career and retiring in my 60s.
We have an audience member who shared, and I want to thank this person for their vulnerability in sharing this, that they have gone through a serious health issue at great personal financial cost, and financial cost that is getting close to financial ruin. And this person is wanting to know what we would offer as a solution for that. And I would like to just expand on that question and ask about prioritization in reaching a more inclusive economy. Because it seems that in the national presidential debate, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle right now, healthcare is being prioritized as that first step to getting us to a more inclusive economy. How would you talk about that on a more localized level?
I think as a country, we've come to the point where the majority of our citizens believe in some type of universal insurance, health insurance, or health care, or whatever. I'm not going to babble on that. This is a complicated subject. So I can't go there. I would say this, though. I think our country is beyond the tipping point of having some kind of system where it doesn't mean financial ruin. You do have access to good health care and so forth, which I think is good. And now it's a matter of figuring it out. I think what's dangerous is that we've gone to, because Capitol Hill is so frozen, we've gone to these executive orders. And we can't have laws changed and rules changing every 4 years. Okay, we've got Obamacare. Okay, now this part of Obamacare is gone. Okay, now this is, we can't function that way. So that whole Capitol Hill problem is spilling over into executive orders. And that's by fiat. And we just can't live with that with 4-year elections and the way we're structured.
Yeah, I just think there's a problem that on one hand we claim to be the greatest country on the planet, but on the other hand, that problem exists. I think it's a problem to say that we have the greatest economy in the world, yet we can't figure out how to take care of our most vulnerable citizens. There's something that doesn't make sense to me when I hear these stories, and that's, again, the conversation we need to have with each other. Is my story connected to Bridget's story? Is my story connected to a person that lives in rural America that supports Donald Trump? My answer to that question is emphatically yes. And I will do everything in my power to use whatever opinions I have to make sure that that person has every opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because to me, that's what it means to be an American. I don't see America the way that it is today, where we have all of these divisions. I still believe that we are supposed to be our brother and sister's keepers. And if we can live up to those ideals, then these situations aren't going to exist anymore.
There's another, I think just one quick comment. There's another thing that's not being talked about these days, and it is our federal debt. It's at $22 trillion. We're going to lose $1.3 trillion this year. In 2018, we spent more money on interest on our national debt than we did on Medicare. Now, that is a serious, serious problem. A canary in the coal mine, for sure.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then it sounds like we're ready for the Civility Caucus. I'm excited to hear everybody continue this conversation. How will we know when we're doing better? We have a question about businesses looking at objectives that are usually pretty short-term measurements, and some of the conversation this evening has been about how it is good for the bottom line to be more inclusive. It is good for the bottom line to have a more diverse workforce with more diverse leadership. Over what period of time should we measure that, and are there other objectives we should be looking to tell us this is a sign of progress?
The time was a long time ago, in my opinion. I don't think that we can wait any longer. we need to make decisions right now that we're going to turn the tide. I think Tom made a great point. Where we're headed is not a positive future. I mean, statistics would tell us that, yet we're not believing and internalizing that. We think that things are going to change, but the reality is that it's going to keep getting worse. So for me, the reality is we need to change right now and make the requisite sacrifices in order to make those changes. So that's the first thing is we have to have a sense of urgency that we can't wait any longer, that knight in shining armor is not going to come. Those people are in this room, and we need to empower ourselves to actually go out and make the changes that we want to see. Now, how do we know? That's a more complicated question. I think that there are studies and experts that can help figure that out, but if you look at our country and you see what's happening and the divisiveness that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, I can tell you that that's not the way that we're going to make a change. So I don't have all the answers from a statistical standpoint, but I think we can start leaving this room and start thinking about, how am I showing up? How am I listening to other people? How am I being empathetic to their situations? How am I doing whatever I can, whatever my part is, to make sure that other people have every opportunity that I have to go out and pursue, again, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that's not going to be easy. The last thing I'll leave you guys with is there's an interesting podcast by Malcolm Gladwell called Revisionist History. And there's one that talks about how college lunches can be a barometer of equity in higher education. It uses Bowdoin College and Vassar College, two elite schools in the Northeast. And both of those schools want to be more inclusive. They want to be more equitable in how they're bringing in students from lower income backgrounds. Yet, one school thinks that they can just do it and it happens through osmosis, and the other school recognizes that it requires sacrifice. And you guys can probably guess which school does better than the other. The reality is that change does not come easy. Change comes with sacrifice and with hard work, and that's what it's going to require if we want to turn the tide.
That is a great segue to our Civility Caucus. Panelists, thank you so much. Thank you for your insightful questions. Please have some snacks and enjoy each other's company. And on the way out, please feel free to grab a Post-it and a Sharpie and just let us know what your takeaways are this evening. It helps inform the way we set up our programming in the future. So thank you so much.